More people are on the move today than ever before. This is the age of mobility, of capital, of ideas, of technology, and of people. Yet many, too many of those who are on the move are dying at sea, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Indonesia, on the way from Java to Australia. We know this. We read about it. We see images. We don't particularly like looking at these images. They make some of us feel bad, others angry, and others yet scared. We want this to go away. We want someone who's an expert or a politician to do something about it. And indeed, with regard to the crisis in the Mediterranean, European Union officials have been debating possible solutions, including mounting military interventions to destroy the boats that smugglers use to carry people from the coast of Libya to Europe. It is widely believed that the best solution is to keep people in place. And there are already many measures that states use to keep people in place. There are walls and fences going up all around the world. These are not tightly sealed. Some people, the right people, do get through, are even encouraged to go through, while others, the would-be migrants, are kept in place, if not always successfully. So at a time when we value mobility so much, we're also working very hard to keep some people in place. And so today I want to take you to a different place, a place of responsible connectedness from which to think about migration and also about the current crisis in the Mediterranean. Now, those of you wishing for definitive answers to complex questions might be disappointed. I'm not going to tell you what to think or what to do, but I will tell you about the tools that I find helpful to think with. And for that, I want you to come along with me on a journey through history. So let us start in 1990, when at the age of 18, I left what was still Soviet Latvia and arrived in the United States. Soon thereafter, through a combination of effort, generosity, and circumstance, I began studies in a small liberal arts college in East Orange, New Jersey, near the city of Newark. The college was established in late 19th century by Swedish immigrants. By the time I get there, it stood in the middle of an urban African-American neighborhood, and it was attended by a mix of international students, such as myself, local residents, and also a small group of students from elsewhere in New Jersey who were there on scholarships. Most of the time, students seemed to get along just fine, but there were conflicts and tensions that I didn't understand. And so once one of my fellow students told me that I was too white to understand, and he literally said to me, "You are too white to understand." Now, this was even more puzzling. What did whiteness have to do with the limits of my understanding? Moreover, I had never thought of myself as white. My sense of self was formed through different juxtapositions. For example, I knew that being Latvian meant not being Russian, but white. Did being white mean something more than stating the obvious, that my skin was light? Indeed, it did, and that's what my fellow student was trying to tell me, namely that being white was also about particular ways of thinking, behaving, and understanding. But thinking and behaving how, and understanding what? I certainly felt incompetent when I first arrived in the United States. I was also often treated as someone who had just emerged from behind the Iron Curtain and so lacked the skills needed for living in the so-called free world. There were big things, politics, economics, banking, but there were also small things. For example, I didn't know how to open intricately packed consumer items or operate water taps. I had only seen one type of can and one type of water tap in Soviet Latvia. My partner used to laugh at me for years thereafter. Instead of actually reading instructions on the packages and how to open them, I just tore them open, like a savage, he said. I know now how to open packages and how to operate water taps. I also know how to think critically and that democracy is a struggle. I have become civilized, one might say, but I also learned something else. I've learned that it is much easier to become civilized if one looks like those who serve as the measure of civilization. But I've learned something else as well. I've learned that while looking white is helpful. It is still not enough. One needs to accompany this with becoming white in one's thinking, behaving, and understanding. And this becoming white often entails distancing from the struggles of those who are kept out of whiteness and civilization, as well as from places that come to be associated with these categories, such as Europe. Now, in fact, becoming white might entail forgetting about these struggles altogether. And so this is what my fellow student pointed to, if inadvertently. I was becoming white and civilized through disassociating from racial tensions in the United States on the grounds that I was not directly implicated in their making. But of course, insofar as here I was, becoming white and civilized and succeeding at it, I was benefiting from a long history of racialized violence in the United States and beyond. And so my fellow student was right. I was at risk of becoming too white to understand this. It is there in that small liberal arts college in New Jersey that I was also introduced to anthropology, the study of humans, past and present. And I turned to sociocultural anthropology because it enabled me to study how human beings come to see the world and act in it in particular ways. When I got to Berkeley, where I did my doctoral work in anthropology, I chose to study how human beings come to see themselves as particular collectivities, for example, nations. And I learned that this often involves emphasizing autonomy at the expense of complex webs of historical relations that connect us to other times and other places and that make us who we are. And so today, after years of studying, practicing, and teaching anthropology, I'm here to invite you to think about what it is that we do when we distance ourselves from complex webs of historical relations and emphasize our autonomy and our innocence, like I did back in 1990 in New Jersey. So let me then tell you another story about obscuring connections and claiming innocence. Those of you who know Latvia, the country in which we are right now, will have perhaps heard references to the 17th century Duchy of Courland, Baltic German Duke Jacob, and his famous naval fleet. You may also have heard that the history of Duchy is often invoked as the cultural heritage of current-day Latvia. This pertains to the Duke's naval fleet, but also to the colonies that he briefly held in Gambia and Tobago. Yet you will rarely, if ever, hear it mentioned that the Duke is likely to have participated in what is known as the Atlantic Triangle trade, that is, shipping slaves from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean, raw materials from the Caribbean to Europe, and then manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. And so I was always slightly puzzled by the glorification of the duchy. Once I met someone who had gone to great lengths to emphasize this connection between the glorious history of the duchy and Latvia by making a film about it. And so I asked this person what they made of Duke's participation in slave trade. And so in response to that, they downplayed this aspect of history, saying that at that time, everybody was doing it, and that, moreover, Latvians, of course, were not directly responsible for it because they were themselves serfs on the Duke's ships, if there were actually any Latvians on the ships at the time at all. What a brilliant solution, I thought. Latvians could simultaneously benefit from the glorious heritage of European colonialism and be its victims. And so in asserting the Latvians' Europeanness, my conversation partner was selectively emphasizing some historical connections while downplaying others. When I began to research migration first at the University of Latvia and now at the University of Oxford, I came to see that this is also what happens when we think about migration. Many of us think that the crisis in the Mediterranean has little, if anything, to do with us, other than it burdens us, it makes us uncomfortable. Just the other day, the British tabloid Daily Mail published an article about tourists who no longer want to go to the Greek island of Kos because there are too many migrants living, sleeping, and wandering in the streets. And some of the tourists said that they felt uncomfortable eating in restaurants with migrants looking at them. Now, I imagine one also feels uncomfortable swimming in the Mediterranean. But these tourists like most of us some of the time, fail to see that their good life is crucially linked to the conditions that set people on the road. Most of the people dying at sea are not motivated by a whimsical wish for a better life. They move in a desperate attempt for a life often destroyed through those same processes of mobility that we so highly value. In the classic story of industrial capitalism, when people are displaced from traditional lifestyle in the countryside, they become mobile laborers, moving where the work is. Their movement is always regulated because capital needs them in some places, but not in others. Some suggest, however, that contemporary capitalism has changed. It no longer separates people from land to create mobile labor force out of them. There are places in the world where people are dispossessed, but no new opportunities exist for them, either because production is no longer labor-intensive or because other laborers are brought in. Anthropologist Tanya Murray Lee, who writes about Southeast Asia, calls these people surplus population. Not surplus labor, but surplus people, people who are not needed by anybody and are left to die whether in the places they live or at sea as they try to move in search for a livable life. Trying to keep people in place or letting them die at sea is a way of preserving our good life, a life that is good not because it is autonomous and innocent, but because it has benefited from a myriad of historical connections that we write out of our present. So, for example, we tell the European story of migration as beginning in the 1970s, when Europe opened its borders to former colonial subjects as a much-needed labor force. But this is not when the relationship between Europe and current-day migrants began. It began much earlier with European colonialism. And so life is good in Europe because Europe benefited from colonial exploitation, and it is not only those countries that actually had colonies that benefited from European colonialism. It is also countries that do not have a political history of colonialism that came to see themselves as European against the racialized and exoticized image of the non-European other. They also benefited from extractive trade and exploration. And clearly, this is thought as shared European heritage, or else Latvians wouldn't be so keen to claim a part in it via Duke Jacob. Life is also good in Europe because capital has been able to expand spatially, that is, moving elsewhere, generating more profit, more wealth, but also more dispossession and more inequality. And life is good in Europe because we police who comes in and who goes out, and we spend a lot of money doing this. But we do not think about this when we look at the people who are trying to move to make their lives better. We tend to think that they should sort out their own problems and remain in place. Another anthropologist, Elizabeth Povinelli, has suggested that Ursula Le Guin's short story about a place called Emmaus might help us to think critically about this. Ursula Le Guin tells us that Emmaus is a wonderful place. People live really good lives there. But the good lives of the people of Emmaus crucially depend on a small child locked up and rotting away in the broom closet. Everybody in Emmaus knows that their happiness depends on the misery of this child. Nobody goes to look at the child, for it is a sad sight, but everybody knows. The good people of Emmaus try not to think about it, because thinking about it is just too unpleasant. Some of those who cannot bear the burden of knowing that their happiness depends on the misery of this child leave. Nobody knows where they go, they simply walk away. Migrants are the children in the broom closet who have broken out and who are trying to leave their rotten state. But we want to put them back in the broom closet, and we do not want to think about how our lives, the goodness of our lives, is connected with migrants at sea. Am I therefore suggesting that we need to save the world by taking in every child in the broom closet? Not necessarily. Actually, I'm not even offering a pragmatic solution. So some of you may say, yes, that is all very interesting, what you're saying, but the reality is what it is, and we need a reasonable solution. My answer to that is that the situation we are seeing in the Mediterranean requires thinking differently. It requires thinking historically, politically, and existentially. And this is because pragmatic solutions scratch the surface at best, and at worst, reproduce the root causes of the problem. The proposal to destroy migrant boats is a prime example of this. Its main purpose is containment, to keep the violence of poverty and war out of sight, so that we, the good people of Europe, wouldn't have to see it and deal with it. The humanitarians among us might donate some money for a good cause, but most of us are not prepared to significantly alter our lives to change the conditions that set other people on the road. And this is also because these conditions are hard to understand. They are extremely complex, and understanding them requires time. And doing something about it actually requires fundamental political and social change that seems beyond our reach. So we refer to experts, and we refer to pragmatic solutions, most of which reinforce the view that the reasons people migrate are solely of their own making. This, in turn, is based on a classic us and them type of thinking, namely, here are we, and there are they, and our lives become connected only when they show up on our doorstep. And so such thinking, again, erases the historical connections through which our lives are always already connected. The connections that I'm talking about are not clear causal relationships. I'm not actually suggesting that I was implicated in the history of American slavery, or that Latvians were involved in Atlantic slave trade, or that you or I have physically put anyone in the broom closet. Instead, I'm talking about formative connections, connections that have unfolded over long duration and that have given us resources to make us what we are today. And they're connections through which we have come to see ourselves as particular kinds of people, as Latvians, as Europeans, or as good people. And by calling for responsible connectedness, I am doing two things. First, I'm inviting you to recognize that we are not autonomous and innocent, but always already connected to the migrants at sea. And second, I'm inviting you to think about what kind of responsibility for the present and the future this connectedness places upon us. And I hope that it is from this place that we can begin to collectively think about what could and should be done about the situation, because alone we're likely to feel lost in the face of the complexity of this problem. Thank you.